So I will introduce John Terpstra in a minute, but I would like to make one statement that's loud and clear, not only with our plants, but with our abiotic, which are the non-living resources. And I'm going to say this: water, we drink it, we alter it, we chemically pollute it, we throw plastic and garbage in it. And yet, as humans, we demand to be there. It must be there in its original state. So with that in mind, I'm now going to introduce John Terpstra, who has had some knowledge in water as well. John Terpstra is a Hamilton poet and writer whose subject often includes issues of the environment, specifically the natural and built environment of the city of Hamilton. He has a special interest in the early years of settlement. One of his poems, called Giants, is on the flat at the edge of the escarpment in Sam Lawrence Park overlooking the city. His most recent nonfiction book, whoops, wrong one. Here it is, John. I think I need to go back to school. There it is called Daylighting Chedoke. It's exploring Hamilton's hidden creek. And so I would like to turn this over to John. I want you to enjoy yourself, John. Relax, have fun. This has been a great conference so far.
Okay, and I'd like to have fun. And good, I'm going to get pictures of everybody on the screen. I'd like it that way. I'm not actually showing any slides this morning, except one. That'll come later. And it's nice to be here. It's nice to see you all. It's nice to participate in this conference about the Carolinian zone and native plantings. I'm going to start off with my version, or one of the versions that I've written of land acknowledgement. We are gathered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee people who lived close to the ground, who touched and were intimate with this patch of earth, who knew and named the many more and wild animals with whom they shared life and death here as brothers and sisters, who followed its creeks and who dwelled in the beauty of this place in ways we can only imagine, bound as we are to the streets of the city and to the paths of settlement. So my topic this morning is water. As you saw my book there, it won't come as a surprise if the form that this water takes sometimes is specifically the creek, Chedoke Creek, which runs just on the other side of the tracks behind the Unitarian Church, which is the epicenter of this conference. I don't know what I can say to gardeners that they do not already know, standing beside their garden and aiming a hose, watching the jet or the spray or the mist fall on all their plantings. I think that my job here is possibly just to keep from getting too wet. Water is life, as the slogan goes. And your take home from my little talk here will be this declaration: turning on the garden hose and standing there, directing the spray, is a spiritual experience of place. Basically saying that flowing water is a spiritual experience of place. I don't have to tell you probably where the water that comes out of your hose comes from. You know, I'm sure, about that big reservoir that we have, Lake Ontario. And you probably know about the pipes that reach a mile out or more into Lake Ontario that draw the water in. There's something at the end of those pipes to prevent the zebra mussels from clogging them entirely. How the water goes, and it goes into that strange looking building at Woodward and the Queenie, that hyperbolic paraboloid, as it's called. It's a strange geometric shape that used to be painted, I believe, in the Howard Johnson colors, more or less. You know, that turquoise and orange. And from there, it's pumped into the the waterworks system to the where it's cleaned and chlorinated. And then originally, how it went is that it was pumped to a reservoir at Kenilworth and the Escarpment. And that original reservoir from 1857 is still there. And then it was fed by gravity down into the city, 3 kilometers away. And that was in 1857 it was built, and in 1860 Prince Edward came. He was 19 years old at the time, and he officially opened the waterworks system. And one of the acts was turning on the fountain at Gage Park. So that fountain is from when we first got a waterworks system, 160 years ago. And the one that we have there now is a replica that was made of it, because the original one rusted after a period of time. They knew the lay of the land in those days. Thomas Kiefer was the designer. He was called in. He had just done the system in Montreal, and he was called in to be the judge of the system of the competition that was held here for a waterworks system. And the various applicants in this competition drew water from very many places. They drew it from a lake at Lake Medad in Waterdown. They drew it from Ancaster Creek in their proposals. They also drew it from the creek that comes down that you hardly even see anymore at the top of Queen Street, just before it goes up the mountain. And they also drew it from the bay. But Thomas Kiefer came along and said, well, that's not going to be enough for a growing city. And he moved it out of the city to where it is now on Woodward, and drew water from the lake. Oh, and Chedoke Creek itself was considered as a source of water for the Concession Street community that was growing up in the late 19th century. You can't see many of these creeks anymore because they're buried underground as storm sewers. So following the lay of the land, which they did, which they were doing then, which they did when they're walking and riding horses, and which a lay of the land that we hardly even notice driving our cars. It's basically an act of the imagination. But I think it's an important one. You have to close your eyes, really. It's the only way that you can see the shapes that were left behind here where we live by basically the glaciers, except for the Niagara Escarpment. The shapes that we have around here are left to us by the glaciers. Either the glaciers frozen when they came down Dundas Valley, or when they retreated, leaving drumlins in the Dundas Valley, carving out the section that we have here, creating the Iroquois Bar. If anyone knows about that hump of land that runs through the city from St. Joseph's Hospital, and the Scottish Rites is on top of it, and Dundurn Castle, and the Rock Garden is at the very end of it. These are all things that you can see when you fly around the city in your mind's eye, if you pretend you're a drone, or if you're looking at one of those maps from the 19th century, the bird's eye maps that they used to have. And it's a way of seeing the place that in a way you're imagining it. You're not seeing what's actually there. It's not a photograph. It's more like when people do a sketch of the landscape, you're seeing it for what it is, without what's been applied. So in spite of all our built geographies, the buildings and the roads and the ways that we've changed things, this natural geography still amazingly exists. It hasn't disappeared except from sight. But in your mind's eye, you can go there and you can actually feel it. And it's a good place to be. But then, of course, you have to kind of shake yourself awake and see what's actually in front of you now. But it's a relationship that you want to have back again, and that you want to live in now despite the visuals, which is partly why I think that you're doing what you're doing when you're planting and watering native plants. You're trying to share in the real life of this patch of earth. The water that you can't see because it's buried underground, hasn't disappeared. It's still down there, streaming. And those threads of life that existed then exist now. So, and if water is life, then perhaps the fact that this water has kept on flowing and continues to flow, even though it's buried and we don't see it, perhaps that is hope, which is something we need these days. It's hope that you sometimes need in the world that we have made for ourselves here. Kathy Renwald, who often writes about gardens and gardening in The Spectator, asked me once if I knew anything about the creek at the bottom of Queen Street, where Queen Street turns and becomes Stewart, in that scrapped landscape down there where the new stadium was supposed to go. So what creek, I wondered. And then I went to take a look. And then I wrote this poem, which is called The Once and Future Creek, or The Once and Future Creek. And it's got a little quote from the book of Revelation in the Bible in it. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing through the middle of the street. A surprise creek runs bright between cracked and weedy slabs of concrete through a vacant lot at the bottom of Queen Street, where railway tracks block the shoreline of the bay. The creek flows past piles of brick and a row of container boxes filled with God knows what, slips under a chain link fence and crosses the sidewalk, falling over the curb and through a storm drain grate, and has flowed long enough now that marsh grasses grow at its edge, and two ducks swam upstream hurriedly, looking over their shoulders when I came by to take photographs. The creek runs like a long-lost memory through a desolate and redundant industrial area, the first landscape of the city to be forested in smokestacks 7 generations back, where a century-old bird's eye map shows ravines, and an older map their water courses, one of which impossibly matches the path of this clear blue line. If the deal doesn't fall through, this vacant lot will become home to a movie studio, a big box in which imaginary worlds will be created, while the real world, a world to which, thanks to a daughter of the city who directed me to this rill, this trickle, a world to which I am even more perilously attached. This world is blocked out and buried. 7 generations. It's so unkind. What can I tell the children? I'm sick of finding reasons and making excuses for the naked disrespect, most of which have to do with money. Although I dare not lap or dip a cup, I take this creek as revelation, whose source is likely a left on tap or leaking water main. I read this brooklet as a line of hope against hope, speaking from the future. So I'll repeat. Turning on the hose, standing in the garden, directing the spray over your plantings is a spiritual experience of place, even a damaged place. And we all live in a damaged place. When David Thompson traveled in the late 18th century out west from Hudson Bay for the fur company, for Hudson Bay Company, he took readings and measurements of where he was on a daily basis and on a more than daily basis. He was making maps and he was traveling in uncharted territory and he was charting it. He was doing so as one way of understanding where he was. He also documented the wildlife, the flora and the fauna of where he was, and it was invaluable to the people of the time. But David came and left. He didn't stay there. Life changed radically during the fur trade for every living thing, the people and the animals. He saw some of that change, but he didn't have to deal with the consequences. We, on the other hand, are staying put here. We have chosen to care for this garden. Our urban areas are uncharted territories insofar as it is difficult to know where on earth we are, if we even care. We may only care where in the city we are and what bus to take. I'll admit that an interest in the natural geography that I talked about earlier and described may not be as shared as I would like to think. To me, it's a thrill. It's a kind of intimacy with a body that you love, the body of Mother Earth. It's a way of placing yourself. And it seems even more important to me now, as we meet no place on Zoom, to know where we are. I am not a conspiracy theorist, but if I was, I might think that there is a hidden agenda to this cultural drive to diminish the importance of place. One thing this pandemic does is to make where we are unimportant, where we are physically. If it doesn't matter where we are, then where we are doesn't matter. And the powers that be can do what they like with it and to it. I mean, that's always been the case in this, in some regards, but it's just following this continuum that's gone on that Daniel was talking about as well. One way of placing ourselves is in the web or the catchment of water, the specific water where we are. Where we are is really defined by water because we're in a watershed. And Ron, could you show that map now? Okay, so this is a little map that I drew that kind of follows a map from 1842 when settlement has really just begun. And these are the creeks of Kirkendall. So you can see here we're looking north. The escarpment is on the bottom there. And on the far left, the blue line that comes from that break in the escarpment, that's Chedoke Creek winding its way down. And that's the main one that follows all the way to the very top there, the little triangle, and that's Coote's Paradise. And then on the farther left, that creek coming in there, that's the combination of the other 5 creeks that come down the escarpment, and the creeks are on the West Mountain. That black line that runs through the middle with the little bridge there, that is King Street. So this is the way this is the lay of the land when people were first living here. Don't you wish you lived here then? And so the creek where it makes that turn, that red dot smack there in the middle, that's where the church is. That's the Unitarian Church. So you're kind of surrounded by creeks there. And that red dot on the far right, that is St. Joseph's Hospital. And the dot on the top is Dundurn Castle. If you draw a line between those two, then you get basically the run of the Iroquois bar through the city. This glacial sandbar that was left behind, that has left behind this ridge that runs through the city. So those creeks you're seeing are on the west side of it, and they're basically, this is the triangle of Kirkendall, the Kirkendall neighborhood, and those creeks all ran through the neighborhood. And where my house was on Herkimer Street, the creek ran 2 doors over, and it was still evident in the lay of the land. In fact, most of these creeks you can still find by dips in the landscape all through this neighborhood. So like David Thompson, I'm drawing a map. of the neighborhood, of my old neighborhood where I used to live, and the hardware store that I used to visit, which became the Unitarian Church. Where we live, where we are is both, it's a geographical location, and it is also the flora that grows there and identifies it. The pacifist refugees from the United States followed what they called the Trail of the Black Walnut, knowing that the tree signaled both good soil and an accommodating climate. So they traveled here and to Waterloo. The black walnut, the sugar maple, the red oak, the tulip tree, the bitternut hickory, and others signal that we are in the Carolinian zone that stretches all the way down to South Carolina. But how about the invasive Norway maple, or the tree of heaven, like the one that's 3 stories high in my yard? What about them? And what about we ourselves? Are we invasive, exotic, or are we nativars? Because we're certainly not native. It's complicated. And one of these things the invasive species do, I think, is a signal that it is complicated, and that, you know, we're not only in the Carolinian zone, but we're connected to everyone everywhere else too, who shares these invasive species. So I'm going to end with a poem that is based on the history of these, some of these settlers that came up from the United States after the Revolutionary War. It was specifically really the Michael and Charity Hess, who came up with 4 other couples, 50 people, and all their cattle, walking up from Pennsylvania to come and live here. They climbed the escarpment, and they established the first farms on Hamilton Mountain. And Michael and Charity Hess started their farm at the spring for Chedoke Creek. And I should say something about daylighting. The only kind of daylighting we can do with these creeks now is to talk about them and reimagine them. So I'm going to read this poem. It's called A Brief History of Settlement on Hamilton Mountain from 1789. We came to a place after many days walking, the top of a cliff, a plateau of wood and meadow, and followed a creek to its sweet water's source below an outcrop of rock tall enough to provide a broad view of this oasis from the strife we had so recently suffered in another land. We gave thanks and chose to stay, as did all our company, each family planted beside spring and pond of creeks whose paths they traced from waterfalls over that long cliff, which served as a protective rampart to our community for 7 generations, until the young city mounted its height, stormed our fields and woodlots, buried creeks in pipes, and sent springs into hiding beneath the trees, the few left standing. The trees, those intermediaries between ourselves and our Maker, whose roots never cease to divine the living waters that my people, naked under shower heads, with kitchen faucets running full blast, forget. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We have a couple of questions here.
Alrighty.
From Rose. First of all, was Pearl Street a creek at one time?
Say that again?
Was Pearl Street a creek?
Pearl Street wasn't a creek, no, but Pearl Street dips down in basically at Bold, and that's the location of one of those creeks that you saw on the map that I drew. So, yeah, that's where the creek is.
Okay. And some comments have come in that people love your map.
Yeah,
interesting too. Yeah.
yeah. It's
When I could figure out where I was oriented there, I think that is fascinating. The number of water courses going through the.
it takes a while to orient yourself to it because it's an entirely different way of looking at where you live. Originally, when I did the map, I wanted to put in streets to orient, and maybe I should do that because but when I just drew the creeks in, the creeks themselves were so visually appealing that I didn't want to put these rectilinear lines across everything. You know, I thought King Street, that's enough with King Street. King Street has the virtue of at least being originally a native pathway, you know, so it's shown to be straight, but it was not completely straight. So it followed the lay of the land a little bit more. When we impose our streets, of course, we're a little more grid oriented. The engineers take over, and what can you do? But maybe I'll do a copy of that map where at least some of the streets are in there to be shown. I mean, I talked about that before when I lived on Herkimer between Dundurn and Loch. There's a dip in the street there that you know, if you're in a car, you really don't notice it too much. But, you know, when we had a flood, that big flood that occurred on Loch Street, you know, Loch and Herkimer, you know, when the water main broke and it just gushed up, then the water went straight to the valley of the old creek that ran through the neighborhood. It went straight to that valley, and then it went through the houses as if they didn't exist, and crossed Charlton, and then turned west and crossed Dundurn Street and went straight for the bed of Chedoke Creek. You know, like it was still doing the same thing that it had done since the glaciers left town. It was really quite remarkable to see. I felt sorry for the people that had all that damage to their houses, but my. The fact that the landscape was still there in all its power and majesty was really quite heartening and powerful, you know, in an urban landscape.
Right. You just mentioned putting on the streets. Here's a comment from Marianne. Could you do a clear overlay for the streets? Which is
yeah, okay.
A good way of approaching that.
Yeah, I guess I'll do that. I'll make a version of that map that has yeah, like the old acetates, right? You put it on. That would be nice to do. That would be nice to do, actually. I would like to do that with the streets, and I'd like to do that with the houses, the way the houses just gradually fill in. Because when you look at the streets, our streets, then often, you know, some houses came at one time, and some houses came later, and some houses came later than that. I'd like to sort of see the streetscape in these different periods of time.
I'm going to read one more comment.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. That was lovely storytelling. This local geography comes alive with your words and map expressions. And that's from Christy.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
And I have one. I'd like to say it's a quick question. Maybe it isn't. If you were in charge in the city and had, you know, unlimited powers, what would you like to see happen in terms of the water courses and the creeks going through? Is there anything that can be, should be done, could be done, even in terms of awareness?
Now, how much power are you actually giving me? Are they
unlimited? I don't suppose we can dig up the whole city, short of that.
Really?
Anything else?
Like other world? If I had otherworldly powers, then I would restore the waterways. I mean, and we would find a way to live with these water courses, you know, coming through where we lived. You know, I was so surprised a few weeks ago. My wife and I were in Burlington, and in downtown Burlington, there is a creek running through the neighborhood, like it's in people's backyards, and you know, there's a bridge where the street is. It's amazing. It can be done. We don't have to cover things in. Unfortunately, often what's happened here in the 19th century is that those creek beds became dumps. That's where people put their garbage. So then after a while, you go, well, there's nothing left to save here. So, okay, what can be done here is that Chedoke Creek could be daylighted, at least up on the mountain at Calhoun Park. That could be opened up again. And also, you know, Well, I'm not sure that it could be through Chedoke Golf Course, but behind the houses there on Chedoke is where the original creek ran. I guess that could be more of a creek too, and they could run that behind the houses and cross Aberdeen and through that property of Innovation Park. One of the original plans, architectural plans for Innovation Park did daylight Chedoke Creek, but that architectural firm didn't win the contract.
Maybe what realistically can be done is what you're doing is creating awareness and giving people an understanding so that in the future better decisions could be made as people are more aware.
Yeah, and maybe people who have power can come in, or no, people who have that kind of mind can come into power and maybe get something done. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. Joanne.
Well, thank you very much.
First of all, I want to apologize to John for holding his beautiful book upside down. I know I've read this, and it's an amazing book. All right, so thank you, John, for your curiosity and passion in exploring the impacts that humans have had on our wetlands. You've inspired so many to consider the importance of water in doing what must be done. And I know now we're all inspired to move forward.